Sarah McKenna wiped the sweat from her forehead as she bent over her sewing machine in the small cabin she called home. The afternoon sun streamed through the dusty windows of her modest dwelling on the outskirts of Silver Creek, Arizona Territory. It was 1884, and life on the frontier was never easy for a woman alone. At 26, Sarah had already lived through more hardship than most women twice her age. She had come west with her husband 3 years ago, full of dreams about starting fresh in the untamed wilderness. Those dreams had died along with Thomas when a rattlesnake bite took him during their first winter. Now she survived by taking in sewing work from the nearby town, mending clothes and making simple garments for the miners, ranchers, and their families. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up from her work. Living alone meant she had to be careful about unexpected visitors. She moved to the window and peered through the faded curtain. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. A Native American man sat astride a paint horse just outside her fence. Even from a distance, she could see he was injured. His left arm hung at an odd angle and dark stains covered his buckskin shirt. Behind him, a small child no more than 5 years old clung to his back, tiny arms wrapped around his waist. Sarah's first instinct was fear. The Apache Wars had been raging for years, and tales of raids and violence were common throughout the territory. But as she watched, the man swayed in his saddle, clearly weakened by whatever injury he carried. The child's frightened face peered around his shoulder, and Sarah saw terror in those young eyes. Her Christian upbringing warred with her frontier caution. She had been raised to help those in need, but she also knew the dangers of the wilderness. After a moment's hesitation, she grabbed her late husband's rifle from above the mantel and slowly opened the door, keeping the weapon ready but not directly aimed. The man's dark eyes met hers across the small yard. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with strong features and long black hair that fell past his shoulders. Despite his obvious pain, he sat straight in the saddle with the dignity of a proud warrior. "You are the woman who fixes clothes," he said in surprisingly clear English, though his accent was thick and his words came with difficulty. Sarah nodded slowly, not trusting her voice. She had heard that some Apache spoke English, having learned it from traders or during their time on reservations, but she had never encountered one who did. "I need help," he continued, gesturing weakly to his injured arm. "I can pay." The child whispered something in Apache, and the man's expression softened slightly as he responded in the same language. Sarah could see now that it was a little girl, with long dark braids and wearing a small buckskin dress decorated with colorful beads. "What happened to you?" Sarah found her voice, though she kept her grip firm on the rifle. "Horse fell," the man replied simply. "Bone is broken. Need someone to set it right." Sarah studied them both carefully. The man's injury looked serious, and the child appeared exhausted and frightened. Every instinct told her to turn them away to protect herself from potential danger. But another voice in her mind, one that sounded remarkably like her mother's, reminded her of the Good Samaritan parable she had learned as a child. "I'm not a doctor," she said finally. "I sew clothes, not people." "You have steady hands," the man replied. "You have thread. I have seen white women do this before." Sarah realized he was asking her to suture his wound, something she had never attempted on a person, though she had once helped her husband stitch up a badly cut horse. The thought terrified her, but the man was clearly desperate. The little girl said something else in Apache, tugging gently on the man's good arm. He looked down at her with obvious affection before turning back to Sarah. "My daughter is hungry," he said. "We have been riding for 2 days. She is afraid." The word daughter hit Sarah unexpectedly. She had assumed the child was perhaps a sister or young relative, but knowing she was his daughter somehow changed everything. Sarah thought of her own lost dreams of motherhood, of the children she and Thomas had planned to have. "I have food," she heard herself saying before she could stop the words. "But if I help you, how do I know you won't hurt me?" The man slowly reached into a pouch at his side and pulled out a small leather bag. Even from a distance, Sarah could hear the distinctive clink of coins. "I pay first," he said, tossing the bag gently to the ground between them. "You help, then we go." Sarah looked at the bag, then back at the injured man and frightened child. She thought about her empty pantry and the overdue notices from the general store in town. But more than that, she thought about the little girl's scared face and the way the man's features softened when he looked at his daughter. "All right," she said, lowering the rifle slightly. but you'll have to get down slowly. If you make any sudden moves, I'll shoot." The man nodded understanding and began the careful process of dismounting. Sarah could see the pain etched across his face as he moved, and she noticed how the little girl helped steady him, her small hands surprisingly strong and sure. Once on the ground, the man stumbled slightly, and Sarah instinctively stepped forward to help, before remembering to maintain her distance. The child looked up at her with huge dark eyes that held both fear and hope. "What are your names?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady and calm. "I am Joseph Running Bear," the man replied, using his good arm to keep himself upright. "This is my daughter, Little Dawn." Sarah felt a strange twist in her chest at the ordinary sound of the name Joseph. Somehow, having a Christian name made him seem less threatening, more human. "I'm Sarah McKenna," she replied, then gestured toward her cabin. "Come inside and I'll see what I can do." As they slowly made their way toward the door, Sarah caught sight of Little Dawn's face again. The child was staring at her with an intensity that was both touching and unsettling. There was something in that gaze that spoke of longing, of a need that went far beyond hunger or fear. Sarah had no idea that this simple act of compassion was about to change all their lives forever. As she held the door open for Joseph Running Bear and his daughter, she felt as though she were crossing a threshold into an unknown future, one that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and the world around her. Inside the cabin, Sarah quickly moved to clear space on her kitchen table, pushing aside fabric scraps and sewing supplies. Joseph Running Bear moved slowly, his face pale from pain and blood loss. Little Dawn stayed close to his side, her small hand clutching at his buckskin pants. "Sit here," Sarah instructed, pulling out the sturdy wooden chair she used for detailed needlework. The natural light from the window would help her see what she was doing. Joseph eased himself into the chair, wincing as the movement jarred his injured arm. Sarah could see now that the break was bad, with bone visible through torn skin and muscle. She had seen similar injuries in horses, but never in a person. Her stomach churned at the sight of so much blood. "I need to clean this first," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "And I need to look at how bad the break is." She gathered clean water from her wash basin and found the bottle of whiskey Thomas had left behind. She had never touched the stuff herself, but she knew it could be used to clean wounds. Her hands shook slightly as she prepared her makeshift medical supplies. Little Dawn watched everything Sarah did with intense curiosity. The child had not spoken a word of English yet, but her dark eyes followed every movement. When Sarah approached with the whiskey bottle, Joseph said something to his daughter in Apache. The little girl nodded solemnly and moved to stand behind the chair, placing her tiny hands on her father's shoulders. "This will hurt," Sarah warned, pouring the alcohol over the wound. Joseph gritted his teeth and gripped the chair arm with his good hand, but he made no sound. His daughter whispered something in their language that sounded like encouragement. Sarah was amazed by both their courage and the obvious bond between them. As she carefully cleaned the wound, Sarah found herself studying Joseph's face. Up close, she could see he was probably younger than she had first thought, maybe 28 or 30. There were no harsh lines of cruelty around his eyes, and when he looked at his daughter, his expression held nothing but gentle love. "Where is her mother?" Sarah asked quietly as she worked, not sure if she should ask but unable to help her curiosity. "Dead," Joseph replied simply. 2 winters ago, sickness. Sarah felt a stab of sympathy. She knew what it was like to lose a spouse, but she could not imagine trying to raise a child alone in the wilderness. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it. Joseph nodded acknowledgement but said nothing more. Little Dawn had moved closer during their exchange, and Sarah noticed the child was studying her face intently. When their eyes met, the little girl smiled shyly before quickly hiding behind her father's back. "She likes you," Joseph observed, and there was something like surprise in his voice. "How can you tell? She does not usually smile at strangers, especially white people." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions at this statement. She realized she had never really thought about how her people appeared to Native American children. The idea that Little Dawn might be afraid of her simply because of her skin color was troubling. "She's beautiful," Sarah said softly, and she meant it. Despite the dirt and exhaustion, the little girl had lovely features and bright, intelligent eyes. Joseph's expression softened even more. "She looks like her mother," he said quietly. Sarah began the delicate work of setting the bone. She had helped her father with similar injuries on their farm back in Ohio, and the principles were the same whether dealing with animals or people. Joseph remained stoically silent throughout the painful process, though sweat beaded on his forehead. Little Dawn seemed to sense her father's pain and began singing softly in Apache. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, and Sarah found herself listening even as she concentrated on her work. The child's sweet voice filled the small cabin with something that felt almost sacred. "What is she singing?" Sarah asked as she began to stitch the wound closed. "A healing song," Joseph replied. "Her grandmother taught her. She believes it helps the pain go away." Sarah found herself oddly moved by this. In her experience, most children would be crying or running away from such a scene, but little Dawn remained calm and helpful, her small hands occasionally passing Sarah clean cloth or moving to comfort her father when the pain became too much. "She's very brave," Sarah commented. "She has had to be," Joseph replied. "Life has not been easy for her." As Sarah worked, she found herself asking careful questions about their life. She learned that Joseph had spent time on the San Carlos reservation, but had left with his daughter when conditions became unbearable. They had been living off the land, moving from place to place, trying to stay free while avoiding both the army and hostile settlers. "Why did you come to me?" Sarah asked as she tied off the final stitch. "There are other people closer to where you were traveling." Joseph was quiet for a long moment. "I watched you," he said finally. "For 2 days I watched your house. I saw how you fed the stray cat. I saw you give water to travelers who stopped. You have a good heart." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. The idea that he had been watching her was unsettling, but she was also touched that her small acts of kindness had been noticed. "You must stay still for several days," she told him as she bandaged the wound. "This kind of break needs time to heal properly." Joseph shook his head. "We cannot stay. It is not safe." "Not safe for who?" "For you," he replied. "If soldiers find Apache here, they will not ask questions first." Sarah had not thought of this. She realized she was probably breaking several laws by helping them. But the idea of sending them back into the wilderness with Joseph badly injured seemed wrong. Little Dawn had moved to stand beside Sarah's sewing machine, her small fingers tracing the metal surface with wonder. Sarah realized the child had probably never seen such a thing before. "She can use it if she wants," Sarah said impulsively. Joseph translated, and little Dawn's face lit up with excitement. Sarah showed her how the machine worked, letting the child turn the wheel and watch the needle move up and down. Little Dawn laughed with delight, the first purely happy sound Sarah had heard from her. "She learns fast," Joseph observed, and there was pride in his voice. "Most children do," Sarah replied, then found herself adding, "She could learn many things if she had the chance." Something shifted in Joseph's expression, and Sarah wondered if she had overstepped. But before he could respond, they heard the sound of approaching horses outside. Multiple horses moving fast. Joseph was on his feet instantly despite his injury, moving to the window. "Soldiers," he said grimly. Sarah felt her blood turn cold. She looked at little Dawn, who had gone very still beside the sewing machine. All the joy drained from her small face. "Hide," Sarah whispered urgently. "Both of you hide." Joseph grabbed little Dawn's hand and looked around the small cabin desperately. Sarah's mind raced as the sound of horses grew closer. There was nowhere to hide in the tiny space, and Joseph was too injured to run. "The root cellar," Sarah whispered, pointing to a small trapdoor near the back corner that led to her food storage space underground. Quickly, Joseph lifted the heavy wooden door with his good arm while Sarah helped little Dawn down the wooden ladder. The space was cramped and dark, barely big enough for both of them. Joseph followed, pulling the door closed just as heavy boots stomped onto Sarah's front porch. Sarah quickly smoothed her skirts and tried to calm her racing heart. She grabbed a piece of mending from her basket and forced herself to sit calmly at her sewing machine, though her hands trembled as she began to stitch. 3 sharp knocks rang out. "Open up, ma'am." Army business. Sarah took a deep breath and opened the door to find 3 cavalry soldiers standing on her porch. The leader was a sergeant with graying hair and hard eyes. Behind him stood 2 younger men, both looking tired and dusty from long riding. "Good afternoon, Sergeant," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What can I do for you?" "Sergeant Mitchell, ma'am. We're tracking Apache renegades in this area. Have you seen anything suspicious? Any signs of Indians passing through?" Sarah's mouth went dry, but she managed to shake her head. No, Sergeant. I've been sewing all day. Haven't seen anyone. The sergeant's eyes scanned the interior of her cabin over her shoulder. Sarah prayed he would not notice the bloody rags she had used to clean Joseph's wound, or the whiskey bottle still sitting on the kitchen table. Mind if we take a look around? He asked, but he was already pushing past her into the room. Of course not, Sarah said, though her heart was pounding so loud she was sure they could hear it. The soldiers spread out through the small space, looking behind furniture and checking the corners. One of them picked up the whiskey bottle and sniffed it. Been doing some drinking, ma'am? He asked with a smirk. That belonged to my late husband, Sarah replied with dignity. I sometimes use it for cleaning wounds. Wounds? Sergeant Mitchell's attention sharpened. What kind of wounds? Sarah thought quickly. Sometimes travelers stop by with injuries from accidents. I help when I can. Christian duty and all. The sergeant nodded, seeming to accept this explanation. But then one of the younger soldiers kicked at the rag rug near the root cellar entrance. What's under here, ma'am? Sarah's blood turned to ice. Just my food cellar. I store potatoes and preserves down there. Let's have a look, the sergeant ordered. Sarah watched in horror as the soldier began to lift the trapdoor. She knew Joseph and little Dawn were huddled in the darkness below, and there was no way they could avoid being discovered. Her mind frantically searched for something, anything, to distract the soldiers. Actually, she said quickly, moving toward her sewing basket, I should mention that I did see something strange this morning. All three soldiers turned to look at her. The one at the cellar door paused with it halfway open. What did you see? Sergeant Mitchell demanded. Smoke, Sarah lied smoothly. To the north, maybe 2 miles from here. Like someone had made a camp but tried to put it out quickly. The sergeant and his men exchanged glances. Show me, he ordered. Sarah moved to her window and pointed in a direction well away from where Joseph and little Dawn were hiding. Right over that ridge. I noticed it around dawn but thought it might just be a traveler. But now that you mention Apache, could have been them, one of the younger soldiers said eagerly. They probably moved on after we got close. Sergeant Mitchell considered this. Sarah held her breath as he looked back toward the half-open cellar door, then at her face, then out the window in the direction she had pointed. We'll check it out, he decided finally. Thank you for the information, ma'am. Of course, Sarah replied, trying not to show her relief. The soldiers headed toward the door, but the sergeant paused. If you do see any Apache, don't try to help them. They're dangerous and they can't be trusted. You report it immediately to the army. I understand, Sarah said, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. After the soldiers rode away, Sarah waited a full 10 minutes before carefully opening the root cellar door. Joseph emerged first, then lifted little Dawn up into the cabin. Both looked shaken but unharmed. Thank you, Joseph said simply, but his dark eyes held deep gratitude. Little Dawn ran to Sarah and wrapped her small arms around her waist, burying her face against Sarah's skirt. The child was trembling, and Sarah found herself stroking the little girl's hair gently. They're gone, Sarah whispered. You're safe now. But even as she said the words, she knew they were not really safe. The soldiers would be back, and next time they might search more thoroughly. She looked down at little Dawn, still clinging to her, and felt something shift in her chest. You can't travel with that arm, she told Joseph. You'll tear the stitches and make it worse. We have no choice, he replied. Staying here puts you in danger. Maybe there's another way, Sarah said slowly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. She looked at little Dawn, then back at Joseph. What if you stayed, but not as Apache hiding in my cellar? Joseph frowned, not understanding. What if you stayed as hired help? Sarah continued, thinking out loud. A lot of frontier women have men working for them, helping with repairs and heavy labor. If anyone asks, you're just a drifter I hired to fix my fence and chop wood. They will know I am Apache, Joseph protested. Not necessarily, Sarah said. You speak English well. With different clothes and maybe cutting your hair. She trailed off, realizing she was asking him to give up part of his identity. Joseph was quiet for a long time, looking down at his daughter. Little Dawn had finally stopped trembling and was now examining Sarah's sewing supplies with renewed interest. It would only be until your arm heals, Sarah added quickly. Then you could go wherever you planned. Why would you do this? Joseph asked. You could be hanged for helping Apache. Sarah looked at little Dawn, who had found a small button and was holding it up to the light, marveling at how it sparkled. The child's face was filled with wonder and innocence, and Sarah felt her heart clench. Because it's the right thing to do, she said simply. But even as she spoke, Sarah knew there was more to it than that. Something about this little girl and her father had touched something deep inside her, something that had been empty since Thomas died. She told herself it was just Christian charity, but the warmth she felt when little Dawn smiled at her suggested it might be something more. Joseph studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to read her true motives. "If we stay," he said finally, "I work for my keep. I do not take charity." "Of course," Sarah agreed. "There's plenty of work to be done around here." Little Dawn looked up at both of them and said something in Apache. Joseph translated. "She asks if she can learn to use the sewing machine." Sarah smiled and knelt down to the child's level. "Would you like that?" she asked. Little Dawn nodded eagerly, and Sarah felt that strange warmth spread through her chest again. She was beginning to realize that she might need them as much as they needed her. The next morning, Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of chopping wood. She dressed quickly and found Joseph outside, carefully splitting logs with his good arm. He had fashioned a sling for his injured arm from strips of cloth, and though his movements were slower than normal, he worked with steady determination. "You should be resting," Sarah called from the doorway. "I said I would work for my keep," Joseph replied without stopping. "I keep my word." Little Dawn emerged from the small lean-to where Sarah had made them beds with spare blankets and quilts. The child rubbed her eyes sleepily, then smiled brightly when she saw Sarah. In the morning light, Sarah noticed how thin both father and daughter looked. They had clearly been traveling rough for some time. "Are you hungry?" Sarah asked Little Dawn, who was now standing close beside her. The little girl looked to her father, who nodded. "She is always hungry," Joseph said with a small smile. "Growing children need much food." Sarah prepared a large breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits with honey. She watched in amazement as both Joseph and Little Dawn ate with barely contained eagerness. When was the last time they had enjoyed a proper meal? "How long have you been traveling?" Sarah asked as they ate. "Many months," Joseph replied, "since the leaves changed color." Sarah realized they had been living rough through the entire winter. The thought of this little girl facing the cold and hunger of an Arizona winter in the wilderness made her heart ache. After breakfast, Sarah began the delicate task of transforming Joseph's appearance. She found an old shirt of Thomas's that fit reasonably well, and a pair of work pants. Joseph's long hair was more challenging. "I can cut it," Sarah offered, holding up her sewing scissors. "It will grow back." Joseph touched his hair, clearly reluctant. Sarah realized this was probably significant to his culture and identity. "Or we could tie it back," she suggested. "Lots of men wear their hair long out here." They compromised by braiding his hair tightly and tucking it under one of Thomas's old hats. With different clothes and the hat pulled low, Joseph looked like any other frontier worker. The disguise was not perfect, but it might be enough to avoid suspicion. Little Dawn watched this transformation with wide eyes. When her father emerged from behind the curtain Sarah had rigged up, the child ran to him and spoke rapidly in Apache. Joseph knelt down and replied gently, clearly explaining what was happening. "She wants to know if you are trying to make us white." Joseph translated. Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "No, I'm just trying to keep you safe." Joseph studied her face, then spoke to his daughter again. Little Dawn nodded solemnly, then came to stand beside Sarah. Over the following days, they settled into an unusual but surprisingly comfortable routine. Joseph proved to be an excellent worker despite his injury. He repaired Sarah's sagging fence, fixed loose boards on the cabin, and chopped enough wood to last through the next winter. His movements were careful and efficient, and Sarah found herself appreciating the security of having a man around the place again. But it was Little Dawn who truly captured Sarah's heart. The child was bright and eager to learn, fascinated by everything in Sarah's world. Sarah began teaching her simple English words, and Little Dawn picked them up with remarkable speed. "Button," Sarah would say, holding up the small object. "Button," Little Dawn would repeat carefully, then break into a delighted smile when Sarah praised her pronunciation. The sewing machine remained the child's greatest fascination. Sarah showed her how to guide fabric through the machine, how to keep the stitches straight, and how to thread the needle. Little Dawn's small fingers were naturally deft, and she took to the work with obvious joy. "She has good hands," Joseph observed one afternoon, watching his daughter carefully hem a dish towel, like her mother. "Her mother sewed?" Sarah asked. She made beautiful things, Joseph said softly. Beadwork, clothing, baskets. Little Dawn watched everything she did. Sarah felt a pang of sadness for the woman she had never met, but also a growing sense of connection to this child who shared her love of creating beautiful things with her hands. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to notice changes in all of them. Little Dawn was gaining weight and losing the wary look that had haunted her eyes. She laughed more often and had begun following Sarah around the cabin like a shadow, chattering in a mixture of English and Apache. Joseph, too, seemed different. His wound was healing well, and the constant tension Sarah had first noticed in his shoulders was beginning to ease. He smiled more often, especially when watching his daughter's delight in learning new things. Sarah found herself changing as well. For the first time since Thomas's death, she looked forward to getting up each morning. The cabin felt alive again with voices and laughter. She caught herself humming while she worked, something she had not done in years. But their peaceful routine was disrupted one afternoon when Sarah returned from town with supplies to find Little Dawn crying. The child ran to her immediately, wrapping her small arms around Sarah's waist and burying her face in her skirt. What happened? Sarah asked Joseph, who was standing nearby looking troubled. Some men came by while you were gone, Joseph explained. They asked questions about me. They seemed suspicious. Sarah's blood ran cold. What kind of men? Not soldiers, civilians, but they carried guns and asked many questions about the Indian they heard was working for you. Sarah realized that despite their precautions, word had spread about Joseph. In a small frontier community, any stranger would attract attention, and an Apache man, no matter how well disguised, was bound to cause talk. What did you tell them? Sarah asked. I said I was just passing through looking for work. They seemed to believe it, but... Joseph paused, looking down at his daughter. One of them said Indians could not be trusted around white women and children. Sarah felt anger rise in her chest. That's ignorant nonsense, is it? Joseph asked quietly. You took a great risk helping us. Maybe they are right to be concerned. No, Sarah said firmly. They're wrong about you. But that night Sarah lay awake thinking about what the men had said. Not because she believed their prejudices, but because she realized that the community's suspicions could put them all in real danger. If people thought she was harboring Apache, it would not matter that Joseph had never harmed anyone. Fear and hatred could be more dangerous than any actual threat. The next morning she found Joseph packing their few belongings. You're leaving, she said. It was not a question. My arm is healed enough to travel, he replied, not meeting her eyes. We have stayed too long already. Little Dawn sat on the bed, clutching the small doll Sarah had sewn for her from fabric scraps. Tears streaked down her cheeks, but she was trying to be brave like her father. Where will you go? Sarah asked, though she was not sure she wanted to hear the answer. North, maybe, or back to Mexico, somewhere we can live in peace. Sarah looked at Little Dawn, who was watching her with those large, expressive eyes. The thought of this child disappearing back into the wilderness, giving up her chance to learn and grow and become everything she could be, was almost unbearable. What if there was another way? Sarah heard herself saying. Joseph looked up from his packing. What do you mean? Sarah took a deep breath, hardly believing what she was about to suggest. What if Little Dawn stayed here? With me? The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Joseph stopped packing and stared at Sarah with an expression she could not read. Little Dawn looked back and forth between the two adults, sensing the tension even though she had not understood all the English words. You do not know what you are saying, Joseph said finally, his voice tight with emotion. I know exactly what I'm saying, Sarah replied, though her heart was racing. Little Dawn could have a real life here. She could go to school, learn to read and write, have opportunities she'll never have living on the run. Joseph's face darkened. You think our way of life has no value? That's not what I meant, Sarah said quickly. I think your culture is beautiful. I've seen how much you love your daughter, how well you've raised her. But look at her, Joseph. Really look at her. They both turned to watch Little Dawn, who was carefully folding the small dress Sarah had sewn for her, trying to fit it into their travel pack. The child's movements were precise and careful, and Sarah could see the intelligence behind her dark eyes. She's brilliant, Sarah continued softly. She learns faster than any child I've ever seen. She could be anything she wants to be, a teacher, a nurse, maybe even a doctor someday. But not if she spends her life hiding in the wilderness. And what would she have to give up for these opportunities? Joseph asked, his voice bitter. Her language. Her people? Her father? The pain in his voice made Sarah's chest tight. She had not meant to sound as though she was rejecting his culture, but she realized that was exactly how it must seem to him. She wouldn't have to give up who she is, Sarah said. I would make sure she remembered her heritage, her mother's people. But she could have both worlds, Joseph. The best of both. Joseph was quiet for a long time, staring down at his hands. Little Dawn had finished packing and come to stand beside him, her small hand resting on his knee. She spoke to him quietly in Apache, and Sarah saw him struggle to answer. What is she asking? Sarah said. She wants to know why you are both sad. Joseph replied. She does not understand what we are talking about. Sarah knelt down so she was at Little Dawn's eye level. The child looked at her with such trust and affection that Sarah felt her resolve strengthen. Little Dawn, she said slowly, would you like to stay here with me, to learn more about the sewing machine and books and writing? The child looked confused, glancing between Sarah and her father. Joseph spoke to her in Apache, explaining what Sarah was offering. As he talked, Little Dawn's expression changed from confusion to understanding to something that might have been hope. When Joseph finished speaking, Little Dawn was quiet for a long time. Then she asked him something in their language, her voice small and uncertain. She wants to know if staying here means she would not see me anymore. Joseph translated, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah's heart broke at the question. She had been so focused on what Little Dawn could gain that she had not fully considered what the child would lose. No, Sarah said firmly. It doesn't mean that at all. You could visit. You could write letters. This would always be your home too whenever you needed it. But even as she said the words, Sarah realized how difficult it would be. Joseph was a wanted man, an Apache in a territory where his people were hunted and feared. How could he maintain a relationship with his daughter when his very presence could put them all in danger? Joseph seemed to be thinking the same thing. It is not that simple, he said quietly. I cannot come and go freely. Every day I stay puts you both at risk. Then stay, Sarah heard herself saying. Both of you stay. Joseph looked at her as if she had lost her mind.
I cannot hide forever.
Eventually, someone will recognize me for what I am. Not if you don't have to hide, Sarah said, her mind racing as a new idea took shape. What if we told people you were my husband? The suggestion shocked even Sarah herself. Joseph stared at her with wide eyes, and she felt heat flood her cheeks. I mean, she stammered, not a real marriage, of course, just for appearances. People would accept you more easily if they thought you were my husband. A lot of frontier women marry men who look different, men with mixed heritage or who've lived with different tribes. Joseph was silent for so long that Sarah began to regret her impulsive words. But then Little Dawn spoke up in Apache, tugging on her father's sleeve and pointing at Sarah with obvious excitement. What is she saying? Sarah asked. She is asking if this means you would be her mother. Joseph replied quietly. She has wanted a mother for a very long time. Sarah felt her heart clench at the child's innocent hope. She looked into Little Dawn's bright eyes and saw a longing that mirrored her own. Since Thomas's death, Sarah had thought she would never have the chance to be a mother. The idea that this beautiful, intelligent child might want her in that role was both thrilling and terrifying. It could work, Sarah said, trying to sound practical rather than emotional. People would ask fewer questions about you if they thought we were married. And Little Dawn would have legal protection as my stepdaughter. And what would you get from this arrangement? Joseph asked, his dark eyes searching her face. Sarah considered lying, telling him it was purely practical. But something in his expression demanded honesty. I would get the family I never thought I'd have, she admitted softly. I would get to watch Little Dawn grow up and learn and become everything she's meant to be. And I would get to help you both build a real life, instead of just surviving. Joseph looked down at his daughter, who was watching their conversation with intense interest even though she did not understand all the words. The child reached up and touched his face gently, saying something in Apache that sounded like a question. She wants to know if this means we can stay in the place with the warm stove and the pretty buttons, Joseph translated, and Sarah saw a slight smile tug at his lips despite the seriousness of their conversation. Yes, Sarah said directly to Little Dawn. You can stay with the warm stove and all the buttons you want. Little Dawn clapped her hands together and threw her arms around Sarah's neck. The spontaneous affection made Sarah's eyes fill with tears. But there would be rules, Joseph said seriously. I will not pretend to be something I am not. I am Apache. I will not deny my heritage or my daughters. I wouldn't ask you to, Sarah replied. There are ways to honor your culture while still fitting into this community. We'll find a balance. Joseph stood and walked to the window, looking out at the land he had been preparing to leave. If we do this, he said slowly, it must be understood that this is an arrangement of convenience. Nothing more. Sarah felt a small pang of disappointment, though she tried to tell herself it was only practical. Of course, she agreed. Just an arrangement. But as she watched little Dawn carefully examining her doll, planning where it would sleep in their permanent home, Sarah wondered if any of them really believed it would stay that simple. There was already something deeper growing between them, something that felt dangerously close to becoming a real family. We would need to be careful, Joseph continued. People will be watching us closely at first. Any sign that our marriage is not genuine could bring trouble. What do you mean? Sarah asked. I mean, we would need to appear to be a real husband and wife. In public, at least. Joseph's cheeks darkened slightly. We would need to seem comfortable with each other, like people who share a life. Sarah had not thought about the physical aspects of pretending to be married. The idea of standing close to Joseph, of perhaps even holding his hand or accepting his arm in public, made her stomach flutter in a way that had nothing to do with nervousness about their deception. I think we could manage that, she said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Joseph turned back to face her, and their eyes met across the small cabin. For a moment, Sarah felt as though he was seeing straight through to her soul, reading thoughts she had not even admitted to herself. Then we try, he said simply. For her sake, we try to make this work. Little Dawn, sensing that some important decision had been made, ran to both of them and wrapped her small arms around their legs, trying to hug them both at once. Sarah and Joseph found themselves standing closer together than they ever had before, united by the child's embrace and by the uncertain future they had just agreed to face together. When do we start? Sarah asked. Tomorrow, Joseph replied. Tomorrow we become a family. As Sarah looked down at little Dawn's joyful face and then up at Joseph's determined expression, she realized that despite all the practical reasons they had discussed, part of her desperately wanted this arrangement to become something real. The thought scared her almost as much as it thrilled her. The next few weeks tested all of them in ways Sarah had never imagined, creating the illusion of a marriage while navigating the reality of living as strangers proved more challenging than any of them had expected. Their first public appearance as a married couple was at the general store in Silver Creek. Sarah's hands trembled as she straightened Joseph's collar before they walked in together, little Dawn between them holding both their hands. Every eye in the store turned to watch them, and Sarah felt the weight of curious and suspicious stares. Mrs. McKenna, said Martha Peterson, the storekeeper's wife, her voice carefully polite but cool. I heard you had gotten remarried. Congratulations. Thank you, Sarah replied, forcing a smile. This is my husband Joseph and my stepdaughter Dawn. They had decided to use the English version of little Dawn's name to make things simpler. The child looked up at Martha with bright, curious eyes, apparently unbothered by the woman's obvious disapproval. Where are you from, Mr. McKenna? Martha asked Joseph directly, her tone sharp with suspicion. Originally from New Mexico territory, Joseph replied smoothly. I've been traveling, looking for good land to settle down with my family. It was not exactly a lie, Sarah realized. Joseph was skilled at finding truth within deception. And how did you meet our Sarah? Martha pressed. Sarah felt panic rise in her throat, but Joseph answered calmly. I was injured in a fall from my horse. Sarah was kind enough to tend my wounds. We found we had much in common. Again, technically true. Sarah marveled at how Joseph could navigate these dangerous conversations without actually lying, while still protecting their secret. But the real test came that evening when they returned home. The strain of maintaining their act in public had left them all exhausted and awkward with each other. Little Dawn sensed the tension and clung to Sarah's skirts, seeking comfort. That went well, Sarah said, trying to sound optimistic as she began preparing dinner. Martha Peterson suspects something, Joseph replied grimly. I could see it in her eyes. She suspects everyone of everything, Sarah said. It's her nature. But privately, Sarah worried that Joseph was right. Martha Peterson was the town gossip, and if she started spreading rumors about their marriage being false, It could bring unwanted attention from authorities. As the days passed, they developed routines that helped make their situation feel more natural. Joseph continued working around the property, but now he did so openly as the man of the house rather than hiding his presence. Little Dawn flourished under Sarah's teaching, learning to read simple words and becoming more skilled with the sewing machine each day. But the most difficult adjustment was learning to live together in the close quarters of the small cabin. Sarah had grown accustomed to solitude, and sharing her space with two other people required constant adaptation. Joseph was respectful and careful never to intrude on her privacy, but his presence filled the cabin in a way that made Sarah constantly aware of him. The sleeping arrangements were particularly awkward. Joseph and Little Dawn shared the small lean-to addition, while Sarah kept her bed in the main room. But neighbors would expect a married couple to share a bedroom, and Sarah worried about what people might think if they discovered the truth. 3 weeks into their arrangement, their careful balance was disrupted by an unexpected visitor. Sarah was teaching Little Dawn to embroider when she heard a familiar voice calling from outside. "Sarah, Sarah McKenna, are you home?" Sarah's blood went cold. She recognized the voice of Reverend Morrison from the church in Silver Creek. She looked at Joseph, who had gone very still near the window. "He's alone," Joseph murmured, "but he's carrying a Bible." Sarah realized what this meant. Word of their marriage had reached the church, and Reverend Morrison had come to congratulate them, or perhaps to ask uncomfortable questions about why they had not been married in his church. "Stay calm," Sarah whispered to both Joseph and Little Dawn. "Let me handle this." She opened the door with a bright smile. "Reverend Morrison! What a lovely surprise." The elderly minister was a kind man, but Sarah knew he took his duties seriously. He looked past her with obvious curiosity at Joseph, who had stepped forward to stand protectively near his family. "Sarah, my dear," the Reverend said warmly, "I heard the wonderful news about your marriage. I had to come congratulate you personally." "Thank you, Reverend," Sarah replied. "Please come in and meet my husband." The introductions went smoothly, with Joseph displaying the same careful politeness he had shown at the store. Little Dawn charmed the Reverend by showing off her embroidery work, and for a few minutes Sarah began to relax. But then Reverend Morrison asked the question Sarah had been dreading. "I'm curious about your wedding ceremony," he said. "I was surprised not to have been asked to perform it. Where were you married?" Sarah's mind went blank. They had never discussed this detail of their story, and she realized it was a glaring omission that could expose them. "We were married in Las Cruces," Joseph said smoothly, stepping into the conversation, "by a traveling minister. It was a small ceremony." "Las Cruces," the Reverend repeated thoughtfully. "I know several ministers in that area." "Who performed the ceremony?" Sarah felt sweat break out on her forehead. Joseph's jaw tightened slightly, and she could see him calculating whether to continue the deception or find a way to redirect the conversation. "Reverend Martinez," Joseph said finally. "Father Miguel Martinez." Sarah held her breath, praying that the name was generic enough to be believable but not specific enough to be easily checked. "Ah," Reverend Morrison said with a slight frown. "A Catholic ceremony, then?" "Yes," Joseph replied. "I was raised in the Catholic faith." This explanation seemed to satisfy the Reverend, though Sarah could see he was still curious about the details. Fortunately, Little Dawn chose that moment to bring him her doll, distracting him with questions about her sewing lessons. After Reverend Morrison left, Sarah sank into a chair, emotionally exhausted. The close call had shown her how fragile their deception really was. "We need to be more prepared," Joseph said quietly. "There will be other questions." "I know," Sarah replied. "I just didn't think about all the details people would expect us to know about each other." Little Dawn, sensing the tension, came to stand between them. She said something in Apache, looking concerned. "She wants to know if the man with the book was angry with us," Joseph translated. "No, sweetheart," Sarah said, pulling the child close. "He wasn't angry. He was just curious about our family." But as Sarah held Little Dawn, she realized that somewhere along the way they had stopped pretending to be a family and started actually becoming one. The thought both thrilled and terrified her, especially when she caught Joseph watching them with an expression that was far too warm for a simple arrangement of convenience. That night, as they settled into their evening routine, Sarah found herself wondering how much longer they could maintain their careful balance between deception and truth. And more importantly, she wondered what would happen when the line between pretending to be a family and actually being one finally disappeared completely. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter when everything changed. Sarah was hanging laundry while little Dawn played nearby, chattering happily in a mixture of English and Apache as she helped hang the smaller items. Joseph was repairing the roof before the winter rains came, and the sound of his hammer created a comfortable rhythm in the background. It had been 3 months since they had begun their arrangement, and Sarah realized with surprise that she had stopped thinking of it as an arrangement at all. The three of them had fallen into such a natural routine that sometimes she forgot their marriage was not real. Joseph still slept in the lean-to with little Dawn, but they shared meals, made decisions together, and had developed the kind of easy communication that usually took years to build. Little Dawn had blossomed under Sarah's care and teaching. The child could now read simple sentences and had become remarkably skilled with the sewing machine. More importantly, she had lost the wary, frightened look that had haunted her eyes when they first arrived. She laughed often, asked endless questions about everything, and had begun to dream aloud about becoming a teacher when she grew up. "Sarah," she called out now, holding up a small sock. "Is this one yours or Papa's?" The word Papa still made Sarah's chest tight with emotion. Little Dawn had begun using it naturally about a month ago, and Joseph's face had lit up with such joy that Sarah had felt tears spring to her eyes. But more surprising was that the child had also begun calling Sarah Mama in both English and Apache, and Sarah found herself treasuring the title more than she had ever expected. "That's Papa's," Sarah replied, taking the sock and hanging it on the line. "The small ones are yours." The domestic scene was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Sarah looked up to see a small group of riders coming up the path to their cabin. Her blood ran cold when she recognized the lead rider as Sheriff Coleman from Silver Creek, accompanied by 2 men she did not know. "Joseph," she called softly, but he had already seen them, and was climbing down from the roof with careful movements. "Take Dawn inside," he murmured to Sarah as the riders approached. But little Dawn had spotted the visitors and was already running toward the cabin, her instincts honed by months of living in hiding. Sarah followed quickly, her mind racing through possible reasons for the sheriff's visit. "Mr. and Mrs. McKenna," Sheriff Coleman called out as he dismounted. "Sorry to bother you folks." Joseph had positioned himself between the visitors and his family, his posture respectful but alert. "Sheriff," he said with a nod, "what can we do for you?" "We're looking for information about some Apache raiders who hit a ranch about 20 miles south of here," the sheriff explained. "Killed 2 men and ran off some cattle. We're checking with all the ranchers and homesteaders in the area to see if anyone's seen anything suspicious." Sarah felt relief flood through her. This was just routine questioning, not a specific investigation into their family. "We haven't seen anything unusual," Joseph replied calmly. "When did this happen?" 3 days ago, one of the other men spoke up. He was younger than the sheriff, with hard eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. Of course, it's hard to know who to trust when it comes to Indian business. Sarah felt Joseph tense beside her, but his expression remained neutral. "I'm sorry to hear about the attack," he said. "I hope you catch the men responsible." "Oh, we will," the young man said with confidence. "And when we do, they'll hang. All of them. Can't have savages thinking they can raid white settlements without consequences." "That's enough, Collins," Sheriff Coleman said sharply. "These folks don't need to hear your opinions." But Collins was not finished. He had dismounted and was walking closer to Joseph, studying his face with obvious suspicion. "You know, McKenna, you look familiar. Have we met before?" "I don't think so," Joseph replied evenly. "I'm new to this area." "Funny thing," Collins continued, circling slowly around Joseph like a predator. "You look a lot like an Apache I saw once down near Tucson. Half-breed tracker named Joe Running Bear. Ever heard of him?" Sarah's heart stopped. She could see Joseph's jaw clench almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "Can't say that I have." "Of course, that was years ago," Collins went on. "And that Joe Running Bear was supposed to have been killed in a raid. But you never can tell with Apache. They're sneaky that way." "Collins," Sheriff Coleman said more firmly, "that's enough. Mr. McKenna has been nothing but helpful." But Collins had noticed little Dawn peeking out from behind Sarah's skirts. The child had been listening to the conversation with wide, frightened eyes. "Pretty little girl," Colin said, his voice taking on a nastier tone.
She's got that look, though.
That half-breed look makes a man wonder about her parentage. That was too much for Sarah. She stepped forward, placing herself protectively in front of little Dawn. "My stepdaughter is a beautiful child," she said firmly, "and I don't appreciate your implications." "Easy, ma'am," Colin said with a mock smile. "No offense intended. Just making conversation." "Well, your conversation is offensive and unwelcome," Sarah replied, her voice shaking with anger. "I think you should leave." Sheriff Coleman looked embarrassed by his companion's behavior. "We're sorry to have bothered you folks," he said, shooting a warning look at Collins. "If you see anything suspicious, you know where to find us." As the men prepared to leave, Collins made one final comment that chilled Sarah to the bone. "You be careful out here, McKenna," he said, mounting his horse. "A lot of dangerous characters in these parts. Man's got to protect his family, especially when his family might be interesting to certain folks." The threat was clear, even though it was couched in seemingly innocent words. Sarah watched the men ride away with a growing sense of dread. "He knows," Joseph said quietly once they were out of sight. "Maybe not for certain," Sarah replied. But she knew Joseph was right. Colin suspected something, and that made him dangerous. Little Dawn had come out from behind Sarah and was standing close to Joseph, her small hand clutching his shirt. She spoke to him in Apache, her voice worried. "She wants to know if the bad man is going to take us away," Joseph translated, his expression pained. Sarah knelt down to Little Dawn's level. "No one is going to take you anywhere," she said firmly. "This is your home and we're your family." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew their situation had become much more precarious. Collins would be watching them now, looking for any excuse to cause trouble. And if he ever found proof that Joseph was Apache or that their marriage was false, all their lives would be in danger. That night, after Little Dawn had fallen asleep, Sarah and Joseph sat by the fire discussing their options. For the first time in months, they were forced to confront the possibility that their arrangement might not be sustainable. "Maybe we should leave," Joseph said quietly. "Head somewhere they don't know us." "And go where?" Sarah asked. "This same situation will arise anywhere we go. There will always be people like Collins." Joseph stared into the fire, his expression troubled. "I cannot keep putting you in danger. You have given us so much already." "We're a family," Sarah said, surprising herself with the intensity in her voice. "That's not an arrangement anymore, Joseph. We're a real family, and families don't abandon each other when things get difficult." Joseph looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, his dark eyes soft with something that might have been love. "Sarah," he said quietly, "you know that if we are truly going to be a family, everything would have to change." Sarah felt her heart begin to race. She knew what he was saying. If they were going to convince people like Collins that their marriage was real, they would have to make it real in every way. "I know," she whispered. Joseph reached out and gently took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "Are you certain this is what you want? Once we cross this line, there will be no going back to the way things were." Sarah looked at their joined hands, then up into his eyes. She thought about Little Dawn sleeping peacefully in the next room, trusting them to keep her safe and loved. She thought about the life they had built together, the laughter that filled their home, the sense of completeness she felt when they were all together. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she said. Joseph lifted their joined hands to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Then we stop pretending," he said. "Tomorrow we make this real." As Sarah looked into his eyes, she realized that what had started as a desperate arrangement to save an injured man and his daughter had become the greatest love story of her life. And she was ready to fight for it no matter what dangers lay ahead.